Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. This podcast is the fourth in the series of joint PRI and Claremont Institute 4th Anniversary Cruise Lectures. The cruise took place in October, started in Barcelona with stops in Mallorca, Marseille, Monte Carlo, Nice, Florence, and ending in Rome. The theme of the lectures was the future of America and the West, liberty, sovereignty, and self-government. This fourth lecture is on Brexit from John O'Sullivan, Senior Fellow at the National Review Institute and former advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. John takes us through the history of Brexit and the economic and cultural underpinnings that brought this historic vote to the British people. Thanks for joining us.
Well, obviously my topic's a somewhat complex and intimidating one. If you think of the word Brexit itself, it's got 6 letters, but it includes economics, political theory, international law, international relations, history, linguistics, and even logic. It's 10 topics, all mixed together. And populism and democracy add other topics. So I've tried to make this as comprehensible as possible by asking myself questions and then trying to answer them. And the first, obviously, is what the hell is going on with Brexit at the moment? That's a very difficult question to answer. In the last two and a half years, we had first Theresa May slowly developing a withdrawal agreement that she claimed was Brexit, but which her critics, especially those in the Conservative Party, denied that it was anything of the sort. They said it was either Remain or worse than Remain. Boris has now succeeded her, partly because, and mainly because, the Conservative Party rejected very dramatically in different ways what Theresa May was trying to do. And indeed, from the very first moment, I think it was clear that she was taking on at least 2/3 of her party. And the political theorists and commentators in Britain and elsewhere tend to think she would win. Almost all of them said she's going to win this because they themselves were sympathetic to a policy which at the very least diluted Brexit very considerably, keeping Britain very part of the European Union. Then what happened there was, in the course of trying to get Brexit through, and the course of trying to get a diluted Brexit through, against some of her own party and against some of the opposition parties, the parliamentarians on the other side abandoned several important conventions. I mean, one of the major conventions of British politics is that the cabinet all speaks with one voice. They abandoned that, and cabinet ministers started voting against the policy of the cabinet. Another one is the speaker is an impartial figure. Well, John Bercow, as speaker, has made it plain he wants to help to prevent Brexit, and he's enabled a coalition, a temporary shifting coalition of conservative rebels and opposition parties to try to seize control on several occasions of the parliamentary agenda. Why is that important, by the way, just as a side issue? Ministers are responsible to Parliament for policy. If they don't control the policies but are told legally that they have to pursue policies which a shifting coalition of MPs has agreed upon, they are politically responsible for policies that they haven't chosen and which they may privately oppose. When you look the last couple of years, the British Parliament, it doesn't look the way the British Parliament usually looks. I mean, that's a pretty well obvious statement, and a lot of people will agree with it. But what does it look like? Well, it looks like how European governments in multi-party systems have to negotiate ever-changing deals with coalition partners irrespective of and often contrary to their election promises to the voters. It looks more like that than the traditional stable majority party governments of Anglo-Saxon two-party systems. They are always been regarded as valuable because they can promise things to the electorate, and then because they control the proceedings of Parliament, they can deliver them. Now, that doesn't happen with absolute clockwork regularity, but it is broadly what does happen. And as happens in multi-party coalitions, on the other hand, May, now Johnson, their governments, and this Parliament have been unable to agree on a policy and confirm it with the EU or anything else. How on earth has this extraordinary breaking of parliamentary conventions happened? Well, it really stems from 4 developments. First, the 2016 referendum on Brexit gave a narrow but clear majority for Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. And the voters in that election were told that this referendum was a once-for-a-lifetime experience. It would be carried out. This is what the parties... Secondly, in the 2017 election, just over a year later, the two major parties promised to implement the referendum decisions and to leave the EU customs union, the single market, and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Parties pledging these things won 83% of the popular vote. Parties supporting Remain or opposing those other things won about 8%. So there was that was the second factor. Third, it seems there's some guesswork is required here that about 2/3 of MPs elected to this Parliament from all parties, despite their pledges, were privately sympathetic to Remain. And fourth, though the media has obscured this somewhat, it seems likely, looking at how they behaved, that about 2/3 of Conservative MPs were strong supporters of Brexit privately and publicly. However, the strong supporters of Brexit in the Tory party did not include the first Prime Minister, Theresa May, or most of her cabinet. In other words, the Tory party in the country and in Parliament was a Leave party, but the leadership of the party and government was a Remain leadership. What these four political events in combination produced, therefore, was a politics of gridlock and deceit. Most MPs wanted to cancel Brexit, but they didn't want to say that was what they were doing, and they didn't want to be held responsible for doing so by an electorate that believed it had achieved Brexit democratically. So they therefore, in effect, had to lie about what they were doing. And the results were the gymnastic moral contortions of all the parties I've just described. And here we come to an important crux. Without some unavoidable event that forces MPs to choose a solution, this standoff between MPs and the voters might have continued indefinitely. Now, the event that initially I did think was that solution forced on people was the Euro elections held in May this year. A lot of us thought that the May elections, when they happened, would force the EU, first of all, force the parties to keep their original promises, and secondly, force the EU to realise there was little or no chance of getting a diluted Brexit, the withdrawal agreement, through Parliament. And this is a point still relevant. Even if that were to happen, the opposition in Britain to actually implementing a kind of false Brexit would be so strong as to make it an uncertain bet. The EU does want Brexit settled, ideally by reversing it, but if necessary, I think in the long run, if necessary, by accepting the best bargain they can get and moving on. The Brits have always been difficult and obstructive partners in the EU, certainly from, for example, the French point of view, and some EU leaders would be quite happy to see them depart. They certainly don't want the Brits to remain if the result is that they obstruct every future move towards Europe integration, which they might do if you have a group of MPs playing to Nigel Farage's gallery at home. It's not impossible that there will be some members of the European Union who will not be too happy to see a no-deal result. They won't like the disruption it will impose. On the other hand, it will mean that it solves the problem in the end of the British being kind of a continuing... Well, the reference I would make is that when motor cars were introduced, the people were so alarmed that they passed a law saying a man had to walk in front of them with a red flag. In a way, the British in Europe have been the man with the red flag walking in front of an EU locomotive. So that's the situation. That leads to my next question. If the public and party opposition to the policy, the 1st of May and well, we'll come on to Boris in a second, led to Boris becoming leader, why on earth is a Tory government pursuing it? There we have to look at a little detective work and history, and look at what has been the dividing line over the European Union and now Brexit since the Macmillan government took the decision to enter the European Union, then the European Economic Community, in the late 1950s, early 60s. It was then seen as a balancing act between the idea that Britain would gain economically from being part of a larger market, even if it lost politically, because its sovereignty would be pooled into the larger sovereignty of the European Union. And that, in a curious way, throughout the next, well, almost 60 years, has been the pattern. Governments of both parties have exaggerated the economic benefits of EU membership and the risks of losing those advantages, while minimising the importance of surrendering sovereignty to Brussels. Both sides of this argument have, in the last decade, fallen apart. Project Fear's projections. Project Fear was that's what we call the official policy advice from the British government and the major opposition parties during the referendum campaign. Project Fear's predictions on the impact of the referendum result alone proved to be so wrong as to make public opinion since then sceptical of its larger forecasts about the impact of Brexit itself. The former Secretary of State for Brexit, David Davis, pointed out, they said that in the 18 months after the referendum, the economy would contract by at best 0.1% and at worst 2.1%. Instead, it grew by 2.8%. That's an error of 4.9% or £100 billion. Paul Krugman is an opponent of Brexit, but of course he's not invested in it in opposition to it that much. And he said of the Bank of England's forecasts of lost growth according to Brexit, they've really gone far out on a limb here. And he gave some details of that, and as it happens, about a month later, the Bank of England cut those forecasts by half. No one doubts that Brexit would involve disruption and temporary reduction in growth. I mean, there may be a few people who do, but most people don't. But the average EU tariff in Britain, average EU tariff is about 4%, easily countered by a fall in the pound, and in the long run, the freedom to deregulate and strike independent trade deals with outside countries like the US would more than offset any losses from being outside the customs union. So that then draws our attention to the second half of the debate. Why is sovereignty so important? Aren't the anti-Brexiteers right that being part of a big battalion like the EU is advantageous? I wrote a big article on this for the recent Washington Examiner, but for those eccentrics, if you really want to know and go into depth, it's there. But just briefly, this homely analogy must suffice. A bachelor is a sovereign power. So is a spinster. But a married man or woman enjoys the benefits of pooled sovereignty. The couple is now the sovereign power rather than the husband or the wife. That's why men find themselves vacationing in spa hotels or wives go to football games. Sovereignty has long been the issue that the UK's voters most care about in relation to Europe. At the same time, it's been the issue that governments and politicians don't ever want to talk about if they can avoid it. Post-election polls showed that 53% of voters in the referendum gave it as their reason for voting leave. That was the largest amount of support for any single explanation of why people voted. But Remainers make a cost-benefit analysis of Brexit in which they attach no value whatsoever to living in an independent, self-governing democracy. This, I think, is one of the most interesting features of this debate. Living in an independent, self-governing democracy seems, I think probably to most people in this room, to be something of real value. We might ask ourselves how much value and what we would sacrifice for it, or what we would lose in order to keep it. But nonetheless, it is obviously kind of important. At the same time, Remainers by and large don't ever mention it if they can avoid it, and at other times they dismiss it with such arguments as no one voted to be poorer. Well, as a matter of fact, that question was asked. The question was asked in opinion polls, if it meant you're being poorer if we left the European Union, what would you say? And the fact was, a great many respondents said they were indeed ready to sacrifice some increase in wealth or wealth for freedom. One of them, by the way, is Michael Caine, who said, I would rather be a poor free man than a rich slave. But the voters take that view, the politicians don't. And I think one of the conclusions we might draw from this is that the voters' morality and patriotism is actually of a higher quality than that of the politicians. How do we account for the significance of sovereignty in the Brexit debate, however, and why these two sides take such different views of it? Well, I don't think there's much of an effort required to explain why the voters support national sovereignty in a democratic state. It's a simple common sense that ordinary people should want to preserve a system of national democracy that enables them to exercise some control over government. It's slightly harder to explain the Remainers, and more generally the establishment's or the deep state's hostility to regaining UK sovereignty. I conclude that the answer is an obvious one. They are attached to sovereignty, but it is another sovereignty. There has been, I think, in a significant portion of the political class, including even the political class on the right, a conscious transfer of loyalty and allegiance from Britain to the EU. Hardline Remainers see themselves as the vanguard of a new European patriotism that is yet to spread deeply into any one country, but has taken root in the political and bureaucratic classes of all countries. Whatever the reason, a significant number of people in British public life devote to Europe the emotions that most people reserve for their native land. So both sides are being driven by sovereignty. But while the Leavers can admit this, it's a British sovereignty, it comes with all the images and emotions of the 1940, the Battle of Britain, the Industrial Revolution, the charge of the Light Brigade, all of the things which you grow up associating with the fine days of your country. Charge of the Light Brigade, by the way, the typical British thing to celebrate because it was a massive, it was a brave but futile struggle. Somebody once wrote about Nelson's great victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. It is true, it was a world historical victory that changed the power relations between Britain and the rest of the world for 100 years. But at least Napoleon atoned for this by dying in the heat of battle. But as I say, Remainers can't, however, politically concede their new allegiance, their desire to overturn a democratic verdict they had pledged to support because they prefer European nationalism over British patriotism. But that is undoubtedly what many people feel. Now I come to another element in my title, and that is this. Isn't Brexit another expression of the xenophobic populism we see sweeping the continent? Now that, of course, is the conventional wisdom, which means it's the wisdom of the establishment of the deep state. It reflects the interests of the political establishment against which populist parties are usually struggling. Contrary to what Remainer media and politicians claim, there wasn't much xenophobia or populism during the referendum campaign and the first year afterwards. The driving force of Euroscepticism, and I would say this is true for the last 30 or 40 years, I've been a Eurosceptic for the last 30 or 40 years, the driving force of Euroscepticism was the feeling that though the EU's supranational institutions may have suited the countries of continental Europe, they were too remote, bureaucratic and undemocratic to suit the Brits. Almost no one in my experience hated the EU or foreigners. In fact, of course, the Brits, like everyone else in Europe, travel freely all the time and they like the other countries. Most Eurosceptics admitted that the EU had achieved important changes that they liked, and they also enjoyed some of the advantages, like being able to move freely through Europe and live there if you wished. That was a kind of relaxed patriotism, but it began to change to anger in response to the hostile and contemptuous remarks about Britain to which EU leaders like Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier gave vent, particularly Guy Verhofstadt, the Dutch Liberal leader, gave vent to these feelings in the last 2 years. If the country were now, and this is we don't know the result of this finally, if the country is to be kept inside EU structures against its democratic will, powerful anti-EU political sentiment will grow in politics in Britain for the first time in my lifetime. It would be directed not only against the EU, but I think also against those who have blocked or reversed Brexit. Brexit betrayed would dominate UK politics more or less indefinitely. It would poison those politics and give rise to the suspicion that our rulers are hostile or at best indifferent to democracy if its decisions run counter to their own wishes. So you must ask yourself this question: which side of the Brexit debate has shown itself to be more in the grip of unruly passions? Which has shown itself more ready to examine and consider practical compromises? Conservatives are wont to thinking of politics and political institutions as a defence against the passions of the mob. But what if the passions of the mob are the passions of the people running the institutions against which are supposed to protect us? The embarrassing fact is that Remainers, MPs and governments have all, in all their tantrums and overthrow of parliamentary conventions, they have shown themselves to be the less thoughtful and the more passionate side of the debate, while Leavers have, broadly speaking, obeyed the parliamentary rules and the previous votes of MPs and the results of the referendum and the 2017 elections as well. You may want to raise the question of prorogation in response to that, because you could argue it's on the other side. I think I have a complete answer to all charges. Contrary to most media commentary, the Brexit referendum was almost a parable of the necessary and valuable uses of populism in democratic politics. And here again I mention that the point is often made that we should never have had the referendum because a referendum is uncomfortable intrusion and a wrong intrusion into the practice of parliamentary government. As a matter of fact, referendums have been used quite a lot in British constitutional practice, including, for example, the referendum on Scottish referendum and the referendum on the border poll in Northern Ireland. A.V. Dicey, probably one of the 2 or 3 leading constitutional theorists in British history, he specifically pointed out that bipartisan parliamentary politics in a first past the post system needed to have a solution to the problem: what can you do if the public are on one side and the parties are united on the other? If this becomes a settled state of affairs in politics, you have to find a way of allowing the democratic opinions of the populace to be asserted against the rule of the parties. That's almost a kind of a classic populist point too. Opposition, and here I think I make a slight distinction between populism and Brexit. There are elements of populism in the Brexit decision and what's happened. Brexit is bigger than populism for this reason. The opposition to British membership of the European Union never ceased to be a significant strand of political opinion in Britain. I went in and looked at the opinion poll results from 1975, the first referendum, to the present. Opposition remained at the level of about 1/3 of respondents, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, for the entire period since 75. But since the leaderships of both parties, together with most cultural institutions, strongly supported the EU, it was rarely at the centre of political debate. The political party, the Tory party in particular, was always more Eurosceptic than its leaders. Keeping Europe out of politics only became unmanageable when Nigel Farage and UKIP fought and won elections on the issue. It was that reality, the underlying reality, that there was a large vote to leave Europe, a large settled opinion, that compelled David Cameron to promise a referendum on EU membership. When the referendum was held, as we know, it revealed that Eurosceptic opinion was larger than conventional opinion realised, and even grew to become a majority. This meant that even before the election result of the referendum, serious articles were appearing saying British politics has now changed forever because we have to concede a very large segment of the populace is strongly attached to a politics of leaving Europe. And that can't be ignored, as it has been ignored, even if the majority of the vote should go against it. In other words, populism in the form of UKIP helped to liberate a genuine and rooted democratic sentiment that might otherwise have been suppressed. And populism in the form of Nigel Farage's second party, the referendum party, which won the largest number of votes in the European elections in May, that actually established that the attempt to ignore what the voters wanted, which is beginning to emerge clearly as the preference of the majority of MPs, that was either impossible to achieve, you simply couldn't ignore it, or it would have to be, if it was to be defeated, it would have to be openly defied. And that is beginning to happen. We should see whether the majority of the House of Commons will in effect say, not in an undisguised way, which hasn't been the case until now, they've wanted events to do their dirty work for them. They may now have to say, we don't give a damn what you voted for, we're not having it. The problem for that, of course, is that there will finally be a vote. That cannot be avoided. It may be avoided, postponed, but it cannot be avoided. And the reason why people are trying to postpone it at the moment is the majority of MPs who are against Brexit know that almost certainly there'd be a substantial victory for Boris, the Conservatives under Boris, or possibly the Conservatives under Boris and allied to Nigel Farage's new Brexit party. That would almost certainly win. That coalition would almost certainly win massively. So once the result of the referendum was going back a bit, the first reaction of the government and of the political elite was to promise to implement Brexit. And this meant that the preeminent populist cause could be absorbed into a conventional parliamentary two-party system, or two-and-a-half-party system. As it originally began to work itself out, Brexit was increasingly debated across the floor of the House and in elections between the voters as a kind of left versus right issue, more than a populist versus centrist one. It was subject to reasoned debate and practical amendments of two-party politics, and that critics of the referendum had previously said, previous critics of the referendum said that the parliamentary system is much more suitable to settling important questions because you can give, take, compromise and so on. But in fact, Brexit was initially absorbed into the democratic parliamentary system quite effectively. And that happened until the remaining elites in both parties reversed their own first acceptance, rejected the referendum result and began to insult the Brexit majority. Then, populism having been absorbed and represented by the system, it was now given a shot in the arm by the Remainers' resistance. What went wrong, and what went wrong dramatically in the last 3 years, was that the Remainers were themselves swept away by their political passions and decided, as the British say, to upset the apple cart. Populism, in the case of both Brexit and the European elections, is more than simply an expression or exploitation of vulgar political passions. It's a serious attempt to realize as much democracy as is practicable in societies with modern communications occupying a large territory. The EU referendum achieved exactly that. Now, when we take this fairly major development into account, it becomes possible to see populism not simply as a way of abusing a political party or an opinion we don't like without responding to its arguments honestly and seriously. So my kind of final set of questions is this. What are the similarities between Brexit and the populists in Europe? Well, both are essentially democratic movements. When you see the rising fear in Brussels and among mainstream European politicians that rising populist parties throughout the EU threaten liberal democracy, I think you should examine populism and liberal democracy both skeptically. I would argue, along with the populists, that for several decades, ruling parties in Europe have ignored the opinions of the voters on important issues such as mass migration and the euro. So far from being an unregulated upsurge of hostility against liberal democracy, populism is in fact a democratic response to unresponsive and oligarchic politics which has been practiced for some time in Europe. Let me describe what European politics is currently like. Several national parliaments in Europe are now dominated by grand coalitions formed to resist election results that have unexpectedly favoured insurgent parties. The most dramatic case of that is Sweden, where the mainstream parties have forged an agreement that has kept the failing Social Democrats in office in order to keep the Swedish Democrats permanently out of office, despite the fact that they win about 25% of the popular vote. And there are similar situations in Germany, Holland, France, Spain, and embryonically in Britain, if the Remainers succeed in frustrating Brexit. Consider more closely the structure of politics that emerges in these grand coalitions, which are copied, incidentally, in the European Parliament itself. The most obvious feature of them is that they create a de facto centre party composed of the old mainstream parties of left and right. Those parties still compete electorally under their original names, but they cooperate on almost all major issues in government afterwards. This quasi-permanent coalition enjoys the support of the main cultural, media and business elites, and not surprisingly, it thinks it's going to be in power forever, though it's beginning to have some doubts on that score. But I should say that since the European Union elections, the mainstream centre-left and centre-right parties shrank to 44%, I think, of the total number of European MPs. But they were immediately joined by what had been the Liberal Party, now including Macron's En Marche. They were immediately joined and will almost certainly be supported by the Greens too. And so they've actually lost votes, but by means of parliamentary expansion, they've increased their total control of the European Parliament. Now, what is the second feature of this kind of new centrist politics? The central feature is a politics of inevitability. It believes in more Europe, the rock on which it's founded, and it dismisses policies that conflict with this overall strategic aim. But of course, this attitude of what I call inevitabilism infects its understanding on all other major issues too. Again, everything from mass migration to the euro, but not just simply those. Third, this politics practices an electoral strategy of exclusion. And why not? If all the clever and responsible people support the coalition, it is surely unthinkable that a ragbag of populists, nationalists, fanatics and extremists on the other side should ever come to power. And if they do come to power, they must be constrained by rules and institutions operated by liberal technocrats should they accidentally win elections. Such tactics exclude not only parties, but of course the millions of voters who support them. It reduces the value of democracy and the vote to the voters, and it protects the failings of the centrist liberal technocracy. Consider for a moment the policies introduced in recent years without proper analysis of the risk, but with overwhelming elite centrist approval. The introduction of the euro without the fiscal and monetary structures needed to sustain it. The adoption of the Schengen internal open borders without securing first Europe's external ones. Mrs. Merkel's invitation to Syrian refugees to Europe, contrary to EU rules, by the way, but supported by the European Commission, without first establishing efficient procedures for either vetting or deporting them. And the gradual encroachment of European institutions on the national democratic prerogatives of member states. Every one of these overambitious initiatives produced its own crisis, from the now perennial Greek crisis to the migrant one. None of these disasters stemmed from populist politics. All emerged from what Pierre Manon, the distinguished French social scientist, calls the fanaticism of the centre. And there is no sign of this Tower of Babel politics being chastened by these failures. On the contrary, President Macron made a speech to address to the peoples of Europe earlier this year, which turned out to be a long list of new European institutions that would centralise more powers in Brussels, and I think also realistically in Paris and Berlin. And that's exactly what we should expect from the politics of a centrist liberal technocracy. It tends to discount as ignorant or prejudiced the opposition of parties and people who are outside the charm circle of the highly educated and conventionally successful. Its conviction that it knows the future makes it vulnerable to proposals for grand utopian schemes to advance this future. Contrary to its own theoretical case for technocracy as, quote, evidence-based policy making, unquote. It allows policy to be made on the hoof by powerful policymakers like Mrs. Merkel. She alone is responsible for several major European crises. It protects failing policies and expensive projects favoured by elites from reasoned criticism until the cost of continuing them becomes overwhelming, and sometimes even then. Topical examples: Germany's energy transition policy and the HS2 super railway project in England. Mistakes and their costs build up because the usual mechanisms of democratic debate can't work if opposition parties are regarded as unelectable and beyond the pale. And when political change finally arrives, after years of being blocked, it tends to be convulsive and disruptive. As a result, this politics has fostered an overall legitimacy crisis of European democracy, as voters find that governments are unresponsive and policies unchangeable. And then finally, in a kind of weird, ironic twist, populist rebellions by the voters are then give rise to a moral panic in the European political establishment about populism. Okay, yes. Well, I mean, in essence, therefore, we have to see whether or not only in Britain with Brexit, but also in the European continent with some of the populist rebellions. And I'm happy to talk more about populism. I've got some more material here, but it seems to me that now we should go over and ask questions about the specific results and specific policies that we might move onto from as a result of my overall analysis.
Special thanks to our guest, John O'Sullivan. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.